Lottie felt the finality of it in the screech of wood and the sickening lurch. The wagon axle, which had groaned its complaint for the last 50 miles across the unforgiving plains, had finally surrendered. It snapped with a sound like a breaking bone. The heavy wheel splintered, and the corner of the wagon bed dropped into the dust, sending her few remaining possessions skittering. Her husband Thomas had checked it that morning, his face already slick with the fever that would take him by noon. He had promised it would hold. Another promise the trail had broken. She climbed down, her movements stiff with grief and exhaustion. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. All around her was a vast, indifferent ocean of brown grass and pale dust, stretching to a horizon that shimmered with heat. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. The small burial mound she had made for Thomas was already a day behind her, a place she could never find again, marked only by a crude cross fashioned from wagon slats. She had cried until her eyes were raw, and now there was nothing left but a hollow ache in her chest. She owned what she could carry: a small bundle of clothes, a worn Bible, a tin of her mother's needles, and a half-empty canteen. Everything else, the tools, the seed, the dreams of a homestead in Oregon, lay splintered in the dust. A horsefly buzzed near her ear, a sound of irritating life in a world that felt dead. She looked toward the hazy line of cottonwoods in the distance, the universal sign of water, of a chance. She tightened the knot on her bundle, settled the thin strap over her shoulder, and began to walk. She did not look back at the broken wagon. It was a coffin for a life that was over. The walk took hours. The dust settled on her black mourning dress like a second skin, turning it a ghostly gray. Her throat was a desert. When she finally stumbled through the cottonwoods, the sight of the sprawling ranch buildings took her breath away. A massive barn, corrals that seemed to stretch for a mile, and a two-story ranch house, stark and imposing against the vast sky. Smoke curled from a chimney, a sign of supper, of a life that went on despite her own having stopped. This was a place of power, of permanence. It intimidated her, but desperation was a sharper spur than fear. She needed work. Any work. A man stood near the main corral, his back to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his authority plain even from a distance. He wore a dark hat, pulled low. As she drew closer, she saw two other men with him, their faces grim. One of them held a rifle. Her eyes were drawn to what they were looking at. A small, dun-colored foal lay in the dust of the corral, its leg bent at an angle that was brutally wrong. The mare stood over it, nickering softly, nudging her child with a frantic desperation. "It's a clean break, Nate. Below the knee," one of the men said. He was thick-set, with a cruel twist to his mouth. "She's no good. A waste of feed. Best to put her out of her misery." The tall man, Nate, didn't answer for a long moment. He just stared at the foal, his jaw a hard, unforgiving line. Lottie could see his profile now. He was younger than she expected, but his face was carved with a harshness that spoke of things lost. He was a man who had walled himself in. "Do it, Jed," he said finally, his voice flat and empty, like stones dropping into a well. He turned away, as if he couldn't bear to watch. And that's when he saw her. He stopped dead. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, raked over her, taking in her dusty dress, her exhausted frame, the desperation she was sure was written all over her face. He looked at her not as a person, but as another problem, another piece of debris washed up on his land. "This is private property," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man who gave orders and expected them to be obeyed. Before Lottie could find her own voice, the man named Jed raised the rifle. The click of the hammer being cocked was a sound of absolute finality. Without thinking, without considering the foolishness of it, Lottie moved. She scrambled through the corral fence, her worn boots sinking into the soft dirt, and placed herself between the rifle and the foal. She put a hand out, not to the man, but to the frantic mare, murmuring a soft, low sound she had learned from her father, a sound that meant peace. The mare's ears twitched. Her panicked eyes settled on Lottie. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, woman?" Jed snarled, lowering the rifle an inch. Lottie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Nate. "Don't," she said, her voice raspy from thirst and disuse. "Please, you don't have to." Nate stared at her, his expression unreadable. He looked from her small, defiant form to the foal, then back again. A flicker of something. Annoyance, surprise, maybe something else entirely, passed through his cold eyes. He had dismissed her as a piece of driftwood, and now she was standing up to his foreman on his own land. The audacity of it seemed to hang in the hot, still air. "She's right, Jed," Nate said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You don't have to." He walked over to the fence, his boots making no sound in the deep dust. He never took his eyes off Lottie. "But you will. In the morning. Get her out of my corral." He turned his back on them all and strode toward the main house without another word, a man retreating back inside his fortress. Jed spat on the ground, his face a mask of resentment, but he lowered the rifle. Lottie stayed where she was, her hand now resting on the mare's trembling neck, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had bought the foal a night, and in doing so, she had stepped into the orbit of a man who looked at the world as if he'd already buried the best part of it. Later, after a long drink of water from the well that tasted like life itself, she was given a place. Not out of kindness, she knew, but because it was easier than dealing with her. A cot in the corner of the laundry house, a small room off the back of the main house that smelled of lye soap and steam. A stern, older woman named Martha gave her a bowl of stew and a piece of cornbread, her expression making it clear this was charity that would not be extended indefinitely. Lottie ate, forcing the food down her tight throat. She learned that Nate was Nathaniel Holt, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, a man whose word was law, and he was a widower. His wife had died a year ago, birthing their first child, a son who had followed his mother into the grave a day later. The explanation settled over Nate's coldness like a shroud, making it understandable, but no less formidable. Sleep would not come. The cot was hard, but it was the image of the foal that kept her awake, the hopeless angle of its leg, the finality in Nate's voice. She couldn't let it happen. It felt, in some strange way, as if giving up on the foal was the same as giving up on herself. Both were broken, discarded, deemed not worth the effort. She slipped out of the laundry house, a shadow in the moonlight. The ranch was quiet, the bunkhouse dark. A single light burned in an upstairs window of the main house. His window. She pictured him in there, alone with his ghosts. She pushed the thought away and made for the corral. The mare nickered softly as she approached, but it was a sound of recognition, not alarm. The foal was lying in the dust, its breathing shallow. Lottie slid through the rails and knelt beside it. "There now," she whispered, her voice a soft murmur. "Let's have a look at you." Her father had been a horseman, not a rich one, but a man who understood the language of sinew and bone. He believed there were few things that patience and clever hands couldn't mend. She ran her fingers gently down the foal's leg. The little creature flinched, but didn't struggle. Lottie's touch was impossibly gentle. It was a break, clean and sharp, just as Jed had said. But it was low. The bone was small. Hope, a fragile seedling, pushed its way through the hard soil of her grief. She needed supplies. She crept to the dark shape of the barn, her heart in her throat. Inside, it smelled of hay and leather and horses. She found what she needed: clean rags from a feed sack, a bucket for water. She needed splints. Behind the barn, she found a pile of discarded shingles, thin and strong. She broke two of them to the right length. Back in the corral, she worked by the pale light of the moon. She tore the rags into long strips with her teeth. She bathed the leg, her touch soothing, her voice a constant, low hum. The foal, as if sensing this was help, not harm, lay still. Lottie worked with a focused intensity, the world shrinking to this small patch of dirt, this one fragile life. She set the bone with a gentle, practiced pull. The foal gave a pained squeak, and the mare snorted, but Lottie did not stop. She laid the wooden splints on either side and began to wrap, her fingers swift and sure. She wound the cloth tight, but not too tight, creating a firm, protective cast. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, her dress stained with dirt, her hands aching. She stroked the foal's neck. "There," she whispered. "That's all I can do. The rest is up to you." She stayed there for what felt like hours, a silent vigil under the stars, until the exhaustion was a weight she could no longer bear. She rose, every muscle protesting, and slipped back to her cot in the laundry house, leaving the foal in the hands of God and whatever strength it possessed. She didn't know she had been watched. From the blackness of the barn doorway, Nate had seen it all. He had come out, unable to sleep, drawn by a disquiet he couldn't name. He had seen her slip into the corral and had prepared to order her away. But then, he watched her work. He saw the sureness of her hands, the quiet confidence in her posture. She moved not like a desperate widow, but like a master of a craft he barely understood. He saw the way the horses responded to her, the trust they gave her instantly. It was a language of gentleness in a world that had taught him only hardness. He watched her wrap the leg with strips of what looked like her own clothing, sacrificing what little she had for a creature he had condemned. He had stood there, hidden in the shadows, until she left. He didn't understand what he felt, but it was a disturbance in the profound, frozen silence of his heart. He returned to his house, and the light in his window stayed on until dawn. The next morning, the sun was barely clearing the horizon when Jed strode toward the corral, rifle in hand. Lottie's stomach clenched. She stood by the laundry house door, unable to watch, but unable to look away. Nate came out onto the porch of the main house, a mug of coffee in his hand. He watched Jed, his face impassive. Jed unlatched the corral gate and stepped inside. He stopped. He stared. Lottie held her breath. The foal was standing. It was wobbly, unsteady, leaning heavily on its mother. But it was on all 4 feet, the splinted leg held stiffly. It took a hesitant step, then another. Jed turned and looked at Nate, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What is this?" he yelled. Nate took a slow sip of his coffee. He walked down the porch steps and over to the corral, not stopping until he was beside Lottie. He didn't look at her, but she was intensely aware of his presence, the heat of him, the scent of coffee and leather. "Looks like you can put the rifle away, Jed," Nate said, his voice even. He looked over the fence at the foal, then his gaze shifted finally to Lottie. For the first time, he looked at her as if she were more than just a problem. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the dirt on her dress, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. "The woman gets to stay," he said, not to her, but to Jed. "Her job is to tend to the foal. See if she can prove us all wrong." He turned and walked away, leaving Lottie with the foreman's hateful glare and the first tentative flicker of a feeling she had thought was buried forever. Hope. She had a purpose. She had a place, for now. And she had a name for the little foal who was fighting to stand. She would call him Pip. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Lottie's world shrank to the small paddock behind the barn where she moved Pip and his mother. Her life became a cycle of changing bandages, mixing bran mashes with strengthening herbs she found growing by the creek, and spending hours just sitting with the foal. She would talk to him, her voice low and steady, telling him stories of her childhood, of the horses her father had raised. She wasn't just mending a leg, she was coaxing a spirit, willing the little creature to live, to fight. The ranch hands watched her with a mixture of scorn and curiosity. They called Pip the widow's folly. Jed made his disdain clear, sneering every time he passed, making loud comments about wasting good feed on crippled stock. But Lottie ignored them. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others were a cage you could choose not to enter. Her focus was on the small, dun-colored foal who was beginning to follow her around the paddock like a shadow. Nate Holt was a ghost. He was everywhere and nowhere. She would catch glimpses of him on the porch, watching her. Sometimes, when she was working with Pip late in the evening, she would see the silhouette of his tall frame in the barn doorway, just standing there in the shadows. He never spoke to her, never approached. He just watched. His observation was a weight, a silent pressure she felt on the back of her neck. She didn't know if he was waiting for her to succeed or to fail. She was a curiosity to him, an experiment. She was wrong about that too. One afternoon, a late summer storm blew in fast, the sky turning a bruised purple. Lottie rushed to get Pip and the mare into the shelter of a small lean-to. The wind tore at her skirts, and a sudden clap of thunder sent Pip into a panic. He shied, stumbled, and went down hard on his bad leg. Lottie's heart stopped. She rushed to his side, her hands running over the splint, checking for damage, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. A hand landed on her shoulder. She jumped, crying out in surprise. It was Nate. He had appeared out of the rain like an apparition. "Is he hurt?" His voice was rough, barely audible over the wind. I don't think so," she stammered, her fingers still probing the wrapped leg. The splint held. He knelt beside her in the mud, his proximity overwhelming. He was so large, so solid. His own hands, calloused and strong, moved over the foal's leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and unexpected as lightning, shot up Lottie's arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He did the same. For a long second, they just knelt there in the rain, the panicked foal between them, the air thick with something unspoken. His stormy eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw past the wall of grief. She saw a flicker of confusion, of a feeling he didn't know what to do with. He looked away first, breaking the spell. "Get him inside the main barn," he ordered, his voice once again flat and commanding. "He'll be safer there." He stood, helped her guide the trembling foal and the mare into the vast hay-scented interior of the main barn, and then he was gone, disappearing back into the rain and leaving Lottie with a racing pulse and the tingling memory of his touch. Life on the ranch was hard, but it was honest. Lottie took over the laundry duties from Martha, who was grateful to be relieved of the heavy work. She washed the sweat and dust-stiffened clothes of the ranch hands, her hands turning raw from the harsh soap. But the work grounded her. It was a penance, a way to earn her keep and the right to care for Pip. And every day, Pip grew stronger. The slight limp was still there, but he was walking, then trotting, then kicking his heels up in the morning mist. One evening, she found a new blanket folded at the end of her cot. It was thick, warm wool, nothing like the threadbare one she'd been using. There was no note, no explanation. But when she unfolded it, she smelled the faint, clean scent of cedar and leather that she was beginning to associate with Nate Holt. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the warmth felt like more than just wool. It felt like a crack of light in a dark room. A few days later, she was mending one of Nate's shirts by the fading light. It was a simple chambray work shirt, but the fabric was soft from wear. She found herself tracing the line of a seam over the shoulder, imagining the man who wore it. It was a foolish, dangerous thought. She was a grieving widow. He was a man locked in his own tomb of sorrow. There was no bridge between their worlds. Still, she took extra care with her stitches, making them small and neat, a silent act of tenderness he would never even notice. He started finding reasons to be in the barn when she was there. He would check on a saddle or measure out feed, his movements economical and precise. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them began to change. It was no longer empty or awkward. It became a shared space, a quiet understanding that needed no words. One evening, she was brushing down Pip's mother when Nate came and stood beside her, taking a brush and starting to work on the other side. They worked in tandem, the rhythmic scrape of the curry combs the only sound in the dusky barn. Lottie's arm brushed his as they moved, and this time, neither of them pulled away. They just kept working, side by side, until the mare's coat shone like polished copper in the lantern light. "She looks good," he said, his voice low. "She's a good mother," Lottie replied softly. He nodded, his eyes on the horse but his thoughts somewhere else. "My wife, Sarah, she loved the Dunns. Said they had the kindest eyes." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his wife to her. The name hung in the air between them, a fragile, painful thing. Lottie's heart ached for him. She wanted to say something, to offer some comfort. But she knew that words were useless against that kind of pain. So she just kept brushing, offering him the gift of her silent presence. He stayed for a few more minutes, then left without another word. But he had left a piece of his story with her, a small, heavy stone of trust she now carried. The whispers started to change. The ranch hands' scorn turned into a grudging respect as they watched Pip grow stronger, his limp lessening with each passing week. But Jed's resentment only deepened. He saw the way Nate watched her. He saw the quiet moments in the barn. He saw the wool blanket and the mended shirts. He saw a woman gaining influence where he was losing it. He began to poison the well. He would make comments in the bunkhouse about the widow having Nate wrapped around her little finger. He told the other men that Nate was going soft, letting a woman's sentimentality interfere with the running of the ranch. He carried his poison to town, whispering to the other ranchers at the saloon, planting seeds of doubt about Nate's judgment. A powerful man like Nate Holt, being swayed by a penniless drifter with a sob story. It was a disgrace. Lottie felt the shift. When she went into the small settlement for supplies, the women who had once offered her curt but civil nods now looked away. Their whispers followed her down the dusty street. She was the subject of gossip, a woman of questionable morals who had somehow ensnared the territory's most powerful rancher. The judgment was a physical weight, pressing down on her. She had thought she was earning a place, but she was only becoming more of an outsider. One afternoon, Nate found her by the creek, staring into the water. She hadn't heard him approach. "The foal's leg is almost straight," he said. It was not a question. "He'll always have a limp," she answered, not looking at him. "But he'll be strong. He can have a good life." "You were right," he said. "I was wrong." The admission startled her. She finally turned to look at him. His face was serious, his gray eyes searching hers. "They're talking about you in town," he said. "About us." Lottie's stomach dropped. "I know." "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Let them talk." But it did matter. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw. He was a man who valued his reputation, his control. The gossip was a challenge to that, and Jed was the one sharpening the knives. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that something had to break. The first snow of winter came early, a fine, dusting powder that outlined the stark branches of the cottonwoods. With the cold came a new sense of urgency. The ranchers began to cull their herds, weeding out the weak who wouldn't survive the harsh months ahead. It was the brutal, necessary logic of the frontier. Jed saw his chance. A group of neighboring ranchers had come to consult with Nate about cattle prices. They were important men, men whose respect Nate needed. Jed made sure they were all gathered on the porch, drinking Nate's whiskey, when he brought up the subject of Pip. "That foal of the widow's," Jed said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's come along, I'll give her that. But he's still damaged goods. He'll never be a top-cutting horse, never pull a plow proper. He's a liability, Nate, a weak link. We're cutting our own weak stock. It's no time for sentiment." Lottie, who had been coming from the laundry house, froze at the bottom of the steps. All eyes turned to Nate. The other ranchers watched him, their faces impassive, waiting for his judgment. It was a test of his authority, of his hardness. She saw the trap Jed had laid. Nate looked over their heads, his gaze landing on Pip, who was trotting in the far paddock, his limp barely noticeable. Then his eyes met Lottie's. She saw the conflict warring in his face, the pressure of his peers against the quiet truth he had started to feel. She saw him close himself off, the walls going back up, stone by stone. The man who had shared a silent moment with her in the barn disappeared, replaced by the cold, powerful rancher, Nate Holt. "Jed's right," Nate said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He did not look at Lottie. He addressed the other ranchers. "There's no room for sentiment when a hard winter is coming. The experiment is over." He turned to his foreman. "See to it before the storm sets in tonight." The words hit Lottie like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. The other men nodded, their respect for Nate Holt reaffirmed. He was as hard as the land he commanded. He was not a man ruled by a woman. Jed shot Lottie a triumphant, cruel smirk. Lottie couldn't move. She just stared at Nate's back as he led the men into his office. He had not just condemned a foal. He had condemned her. He had taken the fragile trust they had built and shattered it on the stones of his reputation. Everything she had started to believe about him, about the kindness beneath the frost, was a lie. She had been a fool, a sentimental fool. They were all right about the foal, and she was wrong about the man. She had been wrong about everything. She turned and walked, not to her cot in the laundry house, but toward the paddock. Her heart was a cold, heavy knot in her chest. She wouldn't stay to watch. She would not give Jed the satisfaction. She would pack her meager bundle and walk away, just as she had from the broken wagon. She was a woman who knew how to leave things behind. Inside his office, Nate poured whiskey for his guests, his hands steady, his face a mask of iron. He laughed at the right times, talked prices and weather, and played the part of the cattle baron they expected him to be. But inside, he was crumbling. The image of Lottie's face when he had passed sentence was burned into his mind. The shock, the pain, the utter betrayal. He had chosen the respect of these men over the quiet truth he saw in her eyes every day. He had sacrificed the first thing that had made him feel anything in a year for the sake of an empty reputation. The whiskey tasted like ash in his mouth. He had protected his fortress, but in doing so, he had locked himself back inside, alone. And the silence in his own house suddenly felt more profound, more suffocating than ever before. He knew with a terrible, sinking certainty that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The wind began to howl as darkness fell, spitting pellets of ice against the windows. The storm had arrived. Lottie worked quickly in the dim light of the laundry house, her movements jerky and numb. She folded her few belongings, her hands shaking. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had something left to lose. She had nothing. She had allowed herself to hope, and the frontier had reminded her once again that hope was a fool's game. She couldn't leave Pip. The thought was a physical pain. To walk away now would be to agree with them, to admit he was worthless. It would be a betrayal of the promise she had made to him that first night under the moon. She pulled on her thin coat, wrapped a scarf around her head, and slipped out into the gathering storm. The barn was empty, the other hands hunkered down in the bunkhouse. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. Pip nickered when he saw her, nudging her hand with his soft nose. The mare watched, her dark eyes full of a wisdom that seemed to understand everything. Lottie's resolve hardened. If they were to be cast out, they would go together. "Come on, boy," she whispered, her voice thick. She took a piece of rope and fashioned a makeshift halter. "We're leaving this place." She led him out of the barn and into the teeth of the wind. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, a blinding white curtain. It was madness. She knew it. To venture out into a blizzard was a death sentence, but it was better than the slow death of staying, of watching Jed raise that rifle in the morning. She headed away from the ranch, toward the vague shape of the rolling hills, putting one foot in front of the other, shielding the young horse with her own body as best she could. In the main house, Nate stood by his window, watching the storm swallow his world. The other ranchers had left hours ago. The house was silent, save for the rattling of the window frames. He had spent the last hour pacing, the hollow victory of his decision echoing in his ears. He had Jed's respect, he had the town's approval, and he had a gaping hole in his chest. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had to see her, to try and explain, though he had no idea what he would say. That he was a coward? That he was terrified of the feeling she woke in him? He pulled on his heavy coat and strode out into the storm, heading for the laundry house. The cot was empty. The neatly folded wool blanket lay on top of it. A wave of cold that had nothing to do with the weather washed over him. He ran to the barn. Pip's stall was empty. The mare was pacing, frantic. He saw the small footprints in the snow leading out of the barn, already beginning to drift over. Hers and the foal's. Panic, raw and absolute, seized him. She was out there, in this, because of him. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart didn't just crack, they shattered. All the grief, all the guilt, all the loss he had buried with his wife and son came rushing back. But this time, it was different. It was sharpened by a new, terrifying fear of a future loss. He would not fail again. He would not stand by and watch someone he cared for be destroyed. He didn't hesitate. He ran to the tack room, saddling his strongest stallion, his hands working with a desperate speed. He ignored the shouts of his hands from the bunkhouse as he rode out, a man charging headlong into a blizzard, chasing the only thing that mattered. He followed the tracks, praying the wind wouldn't erase them completely. He called her name, his voice swallowed by the roaring wind. Lottie. It felt right in his mouth. It felt necessary. For an hour he saw nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Despair began to creep in. He had been too late. He had waited too long to be the man he should have been. Then he saw them. A dark shape huddled behind a large rock outcropping, a small pocket of shelter from the worst of the wind. Lottie was on her knees, her arms wrapped around Pip's neck, her body a shield against the biting cold. The foal was shivering, but standing firm beside her. Nate slid from his horse, his legs unsteady. He stumbled through the deepening snow toward her. She looked up as he approached, her face pale and streaked with snow, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. He stopped in front of her. The wind tore at them, whipping their clothes. He could see she was shaking uncontrollably from the cold. He had expected anger, accusations. Instead, she just looked at him with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raw, shouting to be heard over the storm. The words were torn from the deepest part of him. He wasn't talking about the foal. He was talking about everything. About his coldness, his fear, his pride. "Lottie, I was wrong." He reached down and pulled her to her feet. She was so cold, so light. He wrapped her in his arms, pulling her inside his greatcoat, sharing his warmth. She resisted for a moment, then sagged against him, the fight finally going out of her. He held her tight, his face buried in her snow-dusted hair, smelling the scent of lye soap and winter. He put his hand on Pip's neck, a silent promise. "We're going home," he said. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. The journey back was a blur. He put her on his horse, climbing up behind her, holding her securely against his chest. He led Pip by the rope. He navigated by instinct, his big stallion sure-footed in the blizzard. Lottie didn't speak. She just leaned back against him, absorbing his warmth, too exhausted to think, too overwhelmed to feel anything but the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her back. When the lights of the ranch finally appeared through the swirling snow, they looked like the most beautiful stars in the heavens. The hands came running from the bunkhouse, their faces etched with worry. Jed was there, his expression turning from concern to pure shock as he saw the scene. Nate, dismounting and lifting Lottie down from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. Nate, leading the crippled foal back into the warm sanctuary of the barn. Nate ignored them all. He led Lottie not to the laundry house but up the steps of the main house. He opened the door and guided her inside, into the warmth, into the light, into the center of his world. He kicked the door shut against the storm and the shocked faces of his men, and the sound echoed like a declaration. The next morning, the world was a pristine blanket of white. The storm had broken. Nate stood on the porch as his men gathered. He was calm, his voice steady. He handed Jed his final pay. "You're done here," Nate said simply. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet, unbreakable finality. Jed started to protest, to argue, but he looked at the cold certainty in Nate's eyes, and his words died in his throat. He took the money and left without looking back. Nate then turned to the other men. "Miss Lottie is to be treated as the mistress of this house," he said. "Her word is my word. Is that understood?" The men, who had witnessed his ride into the storm and his return, nodded. They had seen the change in him. The iron had been forged into something stronger than hardness. It had been forged into devotion. Spring came, melting the snow and turning the brown hills a vibrant green. Pip, now a sturdy young colt, ran in the main pasture with the other yearlings. His leg was straight and strong. If you looked closely, you could see a slight, almost imperceptible dip in his gait when he cantered, a subtle reminder of the break. But he ran with a freedom and joy that was a testament to his own resilience and to the woman who had refused to give up on him. Lottie sat on the porch swing of the main house, a mending basket in her lap. The house was no longer a silent, grieving place. It was filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of her humming. It was a home. Her home. Nate came and sat beside her, not on the swing, but on the top step, leaning against the post. He had been doing that a lot lately, just being near her, sharing the comfortable silence that had grown between them. He had been slowly, carefully, telling her about his wife, Sarah, sharing memories not as a man trapped in the past, but as one making peace with it. And she had listened, understanding that he wasn't comparing, but connecting. He was showing her the empty spaces in his life, and in doing so, inviting her to fill them. He held something in his hand, turning it over and over. He reached out and placed it in her open palm. It was a small horse, carved from a piece of cottonwood, its every detail perfect, right down to the faint telltale limp in its right foreleg. It was Pip. Lottie's breath caught. She ran her thumb over the smooth wood. "The house is better with you in it?" he said, his voice quiet and a little rough. He wasn't a man for flowery speeches. His words were like him, solid, unadorned, and true. "I was thinking it should stay that way." It wasn't a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. It was something more profound. It was an admission of need. It was a statement of fact. He was a man who had closed himself off from the world, and she was the one who had patiently, stubbornly found the key. She looked from the small wooden horse to the man beside her. His stormy eyes were clear now, and they were full of a quiet, steady warmth that was just for her. She had arrived here broken and alone, a piece of driftwood on his shore. She had thought him cold, unfeeling, a man beyond saving. She had been so sure she was wrong about everything. But looking at him now, watching Pip run free in the pasture, she knew the truth. They had all been wrong about the foal, and she had been wonderfully, gloriously, life-alteringly wrong about the man. "Yes," she said softly, her fingers closing around the small wooden horse. "I think it should." Her hand found his, and their fingers intertwined, a simple, quiet gesture that promised a lifetime of shared sunrises.